Okay, welcome back to this lecture. We're going to study implicature in a little more detail. Remember, implicature is meaning that we can communicate, we can either express or we can understand, despite the fact that the meaning is not stated in the words and sentences that are in an utterance. Somehow we're able to communicate meaning through conversation beyond the words that we actually say. This kind of meaning is called implicature. And it seems that it's possible based on something known as the cooperative principle, that we cooperate with one another in order to achieve successful communication. And so in order for this to work, both listeners and speakers need to assume that the person they're interacting with is cooperating. So the principle is basically stated as assume that people in conversations cooperate with one another to communicate. Now, since conversations always involve speakers and listeners, and we take turns, right? First we listen, and then it's our turn to speak, and then our listeners become the next speakers. It's a kind of back and forth that creates the conversation. Well, while we're listeners, we assume that a speaker is trying to communicate cooperatively. So if something doesn't make sense, we have to figure out what is this speaker trying to communicate. And likewise, speakers assume that a listener is trying to understand their speech cooperatively. So the particular ways of saying things will be chosen in order to communicate in an effective way that listeners can successfully understand the meaning. Now, the conversational principle, the cooperative principle has been broken down into 4 maxims, what we call the conversational maxims, or the maxims of conversation. Maxims are like principles, but very specific ones. And the 4 maxims of conversation are quantity, quality, relation, and manner. Quantity refers to the amount of information. And in order to communicate cooperatively and effectively, we give enough information that the listener will understand our meaning, but not too much information. Right? That would not be cooperative. That would be wasting the listener's time. That would be confusing. Quality refers to the quality of the information, right? That we give information that we know or believe to be true. The maxim is, do not say what you believe to be false or something for which you lack evidence. Basically, we want to give true information. And generally we do, although we'll see in a few minutes, not always. The maxim of relation basically means that make sure that whatever you say is related to the conversation. It's easier to understand meaning when it's connected with the conversation that you are currently participating in. And the maxim of manner refers to how you express your meaning. So do not be obscure, do not be ambiguous or difficult to understand. Right? Now, to simplify these, quantity basically means to be efficient, right? To give the right amount of information, not too little, not too much. Right? Quality is basically be accurate, right? Give truthful, accurate information, at least to the best of your ability. Relation, basically be relevant. Right? What you say should be relevant to the listener and relevant to the topic of conversation at this moment. And manner is essentially to be clear. Right? You say things in a clear and easy to understand way. Now, in general, we usually observe the maxims of conversation. That means we respect them, we follow them, but not always. There are certain conditions where we kind of break the rules, where we violate a maxim of conversation. And we do this on purpose. Sometimes we do it for a good reason, and sometimes we do it for a less than good reason. So there are 2 ways to violate a maxim of conversation. One is we might quietly or secretly fail to observe one of the maxims. This means I know I'm violating the maxim, but I'm not making that clear to my listener. Well, why would I do that? Well, I might want to lie. I may have a reason for keeping the truth to myself. Or maybe in order to express a joke, or to play a trick, or maybe to avoid my own embarrassment. I don't want to be completely honest about something. But when you violate a maxim of conversation, you're doing so in a way that the listener doesn't really realize it. The listener continues to assume that you are communicating cooperatively, that you are respecting the maxims of conversation. But when you violate a maxim of conversation, you are doing so secretly. Now, if we were very careful and could kind of find out the truth, right, that you have lied, or you've tricked us, or you're trying to avoid embarrassment, but in fact we now know the truth, we will have learned that you have violated the maxim of conversation. This is different from cases where we openly violate, or when we don't say violate, we say flout. We flout a maxim when we openly fail to observe one of the maxims, meaning the listener clearly knows what we're saying fails to meet one of the maxims of conversation. And in doing so, that allows us to communicate additional meaning. That allows us to communicate through implicature. Right? We're being very clear, hey, I've flouted this maxim. There's nothing secret, nothing hidden, nothing quiet about the violation. It's obvious to the listener that we have flouted a maxim of conversation, but for an important reason. In doing so, it allows us to communicate additional meaning. Let's look at a few examples. So let's go back to Annie and Mike, who we've heard from before. And Annie asks Mike, did you pass the driving test? And Mike answers, no. But Mike knows he's passed the test. Is he violating a maxim of conversation? Or is he flouting a maxim of conversation? Or is he observing the maxims of conversation? Well, he knows he's passed the test, and he has answered no. So he has not observed the maxims of conversation. In particular, he has not observed the maxim of quality. Right? He has not said what he knows to be true. Right? Basically, hey, that's a lie. Right? And for some reason, he may have to lie. I don't know what it is. Maybe Annie needs to have a ride and wants Mike to drive her somewhere, but he'd rather not, so he doesn't want her to know that he's passed his driving test. Different people have different reasons for lying. It's possible to lie, but it's only possible to lie when you know that the listener assumes you are following the maxim of quality. Let's look at number 2. This time, Annie says to Mike, do you want more soup? And Mike answers, well, in this case, Mike has just had a tooth removed at the dentist's. Right? So he's not failing to communicate on purpose. Right? He has pain in his mouth. His tooth and gums are swollen. So he's not failing to observe a maxim of conversation in order to communicate through implicature, but he's not giving enough information, right? He has failed to observe the maxim of quantity, right? Because Annie doesn't know whether he wants more soup or not. Right? So there's not enough information. Okay. Let's look at number 3. Annie says, I really liked that dinner. Mike answers, I'm a vegetarian. Well, wait a minute. How does that... What is the meaning of I'm a vegetarian in this conversation? Mike has said, I'm a vegetarian. Annie is a little confused, perhaps. But no, she's not confused. She realizes, aha, wait a minute. We've just had this big turkey dinner with ham and meat, and Mike is telling me he's a vegetarian. So clearly he's saying, well, he didn't really like the meal, or it really wasn't good for him. So there has been a failure to observe the maxim of relation. I'm a vegetarian isn't directly related to I really liked that dinner. But because the principle of cooperation is available, Annie knows that Mike is respecting the maxims of conversation and has openly flouted the maxim of relation, and therefore communicated through implicature that he didn't like the dinner. Number 4, a teacher and a student, perhaps near the end of class. The teacher asks, "What time is it?" And the student answers, 10:44 and 35.6 seconds. Well, clearly this violates this flouts the maxim of quantity. Right? That's more information or more precise information than we typically answer to the question, what time is it? Now, why would somebody flout a maxim of quantity in that way? Well, maybe it's a way to be humorous. It's a little bit of a joke. or a very, very funny joke. Or maybe not much of a funny joke at all. Okay, and let's go on then to number 5. The student says, "How are you?" Student B, "I'm dead." Well, clearly this violates the maxim of quality, because a person can't honestly, truthfully answer, "I'm dead," since when we're dead, we can't speak. So clearly this is an example of flouting the maxim of quality in order to communicate something through implicature. What's being communicated through implicature? Well, student B is extremely exhausted and is out of energy, so much feels like he or she is dead, right? Okay, let's go back to the examples we saw before and consider which maxim of conversation is involved in the conversation. So Virginia and Mike, it wasn't Mike before, it was Virginia and somebody else. Okay, well, Virginia is this time asking Mike, "Do you like my hat?" And Mike answers, "It's pink." Well, Virginia recognizes that its color is not answering the question whether you like my hat or not. Yet, given the cooperative principle and the maxim of relation, Virginia can assume that Mike is saying something that is related to the conversation. It's related to her question. Therefore, she connects the pink of his utterance to whether he likes it or not. Now, whether she interprets that as him liking the hat or not liking the hat will depend on other information, such as whether pink is Mike's favorite color or not, or whether or some other factor. In number 2, Maggie says coffee, and James answers, "It would keep me up all night." Here again, Maggie has to understand, how is James's utterance related to my offer? And she comes to the conclusion that he wants more coffee if she knows that he needs to study all night for an exam tomorrow. Or she might come to the conclusion that he doesn't want it because she knows he needs to get a good night's sleep. The point is, she needs to understand the meaning beyond the words that are said, and it's his openly flouting the maxim of relation that allows him to communicate his meaning. Number 3, the mother and son. I see I've changed my names from Jean and I forget, Linda maybe. The mother says, have you finished the student evaluation forms and the reading lists? And the son answers, I've done the reading lists. Well, the amount of information he's communicated is assumed to be the right amount, right? To follow the maxim of quantity is to give the right amount of information. Therefore, the mother can assume that her son has not done the evaluation forms, although he has said, I've done the reading lists, which by itself doesn't mean he didn't do the student evaluation forms. But as an utterance in a conversation, after her question, have you finished the student evaluation forms and the reading lists? In that context, given the maxim of quantity as part of the cooperative principle, she can infer, she can understand from her son's utterance that he means he has not done the evaluation forms. In number 4, Phil asks, are you going to Steve's barbecue? Terry says, well, Steve's got those dogs now. Well, how are his dogs related to the question about going to the barbecue? Well, Phil understands that they're related because Terry doesn't want to go to the party with Steve's dogs. Right? That's communicated by recognizing that Terry has openly flouted the maxim of relation. And in number 5, was the dessert any good? Annie, cherry pie is cherry pie. Well, at first, that doesn't seem to have much information. Right? So the amount of information, cherry pie is cherry pie, seems to be near zero, since the house is the house, Monday is Monday. To say cherry pie is cherry pie doesn't actually express a lot of information. But in this context, Annie recognizes that Mike is communicating cooperatively. Therefore, if he expresses a sentence that so openly, so clearly fails to observe the maxim of quantity, he must be communicating something more through implicature. So we understand and we express our implicatures through openly flouting the maxims of conversation. And we can flout the maxim of quantity, quality, relation, or manner. Let's go on to a couple final examples. So here's a conversation between Carmen and Dave, and then I'll ask you a question. Right? Carmen says to Dave, or asks Dave, did you get the milk and the eggs? Dave says, I got the milk. This should look familiar, I hope. So my question to you is, did Dave buy the eggs? What do you think? Well, let's follow the steps. Let's think about this, right? So first, I've asked about the milk and eggs. And I can assume that Dave is cooperating in order to communicate effectively. But I'm also going to assume that Dave is respecting the maxim of quantity, but he hasn't said anything about the eggs. Therefore, he must be communicating some additional meaning about the eggs, even though he has only mentioned the milk. I know he has communicated that he did not get the eggs, even without saying anything about the eggs. Well, how has he done that? He's done that because of the maxim of quantity as part of the cooperative principle that allows communication to work. Let's look at another example. Carmen asks Dave, did you manage to fix that leak? Dave answers, I tried to. Well, we can infer that Dave did not manage to fix the leak. Right? Since if he had managed to fix the leak, he might answer yes. I tried to has the additional meaning of I tried to, but I did not manage to fix the leak because of the quantity of information. Surely if he had managed to fix the leak, then that would mean first, he tried to fix it, and second, he successfully fixed it, which means he managed to fix it. But in this case, he only expresses the meaning I tried to, which communicates through implicature the additional meaning that he didn't manage to fix the leak. Or how about this one with Faye and Ed? I hear you've invited Matt and Chris. I didn't invite Matt, Ed says. Does that mean Ed invited Chris? Well, generally, yes. Right? If he says I didn't invite Matt, I can figure out, based on the maxim of quantity, that he did invite Chris. Okay? And the last example, Steve and Jane. Steve says, "What happened to your flowers?" Jane says, "A dog got into the garden." My question is, did the dog belong to Jane? Well, the answer is no, because she said a dog. Right? Now, surely if it was her dog, a dog got into the garden is true, but there is the implicature that the dog belongs to someone else because of the maxim of quantity, the amount of information about this dog. And the dog is referred to as a dog, so Steve can infer or figure out that the dog that got into the garden was not Jane's own dog. Okay, let's look at a few more. Jane and Steve. Jane asks, "Who used all the printer paper?" Steve answers, "I used some of it." What's the implicature of Steve's utterance? Who used all the printer paper? I used some of it. Well, given the maxim of quantity, the amount of information, we can infer, we can figure out that he is also communicating that he didn't use all the paper. He only used some of it. Or, in Jane and Steve again, "I hear you're always late with the rent." Well, sometimes I am. What is the implicature of Steve's utterance? Well, sometimes I am. Steve's utterance has the implicature that he does not always pay his rent late. Right? Even though he didn't express that in words, that meaning is communicated by the utterance, "Well, sometimes I am." Mike and Annie should be here by now. Was their plane late? Possibly. What is the implicature of Steve's response, possibly? Well, because he's respecting the maxims of conversation, we can assume he gives quality information and the right quantity of information. And so we can infer, we can figure out that Steve does not know whether their plane was late. If he did know, and he answered possibly, well, of course it's possible, but he would know that. But in this case, we can infer that he doesn't know it. Now, what if I change the situation and described a context in which Steve really has, in fact, used all the paper? Now, when he answers, "I used some of it," he's communicating that he didn't use all the paper when in fact he did. So it's an example of either lying or trying to avoid embarrassment. For some reason, he wants to miscommunicate and leave Jane believing that he used only some of it. It's kind of a tricky way of lying, but not fully lying, because it's true he used some of it. He also used more of it. He used a lot of it, and he used all of it. So all of those are true, but they give the implicature that he didn't use all of it, all of the paper. Or in the second example, if Steve has actually paid his rent late every month, and he answers, well, sometimes I am, he gives the implicature that he does not always pay his rent late, when in fact he truly does. And here again, why would he do that? Well, he might do that to avoid embarrassment in front of Jane or something. But this would be an example not of flouting the maxim of conversation, but rather quietly or secretly violating the maxim of conversation, in particular the maxim of quantity. And in the last example, if Steve knows that Mike and Annie will be late because Annie called him from the airport, then when he utters possibly, he's actually not being truthful. Right? He's violating the maxim of quality. Now, he may have a reason for doing that. Maybe there's going to be some surprise. They're preparing a surprise party for Jane or something. But nevertheless, he's not openly flouting, but rather quietly or secretly violating the maxim of quality. Okay, well, let's stop there. Please remember that if I can answer any questions, I'm always available by email, or you can post a question in the forum on Manaba, and I will try to respond as quickly as I can. Okay. Now, there will be an exercise on Manaba and an additional video, so I'll see you in the next video.